So good evening, everybody. My name is Manuel Sirauki, and I want to welcome you all to the Artist on Artist lecture series at DIA. Initiated 12 years ago, this program aims to bring artists we follow and admire into a dialogue with DIA's collection, sites, and program of exhibitions and performances. This is a very important program for us, as it gives us the opportunity to hear the resonance of one conception of art through another, and to expand our knowledge about the artist speaking and the artist spoken of simultaneously. We are grateful to all of you for the enthusiastic follow of this program, which is supported in part with public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs. We're also thankful to Brooklyn Brewery, for the complimentary beers. I would also like to acknowledge, of course, my colleagues at the Art Foundation for their assistance in synchronizing all elements of this program. Finally, I would like to thank our guest speaker this evening, Ian Wallace, who accepted our invitation to participate in this series with incredible excitement and commitment, and took the challenge of speaking about the work of Blinky Palermo. In a few lines, I will try to summarize the remarkable importance Ian Wallace's trajectory as an artist, scholar, and educator has had. Born in Shoreham, England in 1943, Ian Wallace moved with his family to British Columbia in Canada at age 1, where he has lived almost continuously ever since. In 1966, he obtained his Bachelor of Arts degree from UBC to begin teaching art history in 1967 before he completed a master's thesis on P. Mondrian and neoplasticism. In the coming years, such important figures as Jeff Wall, Rodney Graham, Ken Lom, and Stan Douglas will be among his students, friends, and occasional collaborators. The first two also became Wallace's partners in the new wave punk band U-Jerks in the 70s. Wallace's first mature works from the late 1960s were slender canvases that follow a strict monochrome agenda, and minimalist sculptures consisting of timber stock draped with transparent plastic. As he decided to abandon painting and sculpture in 1969, Wallace started producing collages and photographs toward what he would call later on photo-conceptualism, a current of which he himself became one of the foremost pioneers. Starting with Magazine Piece in 1970, Ian Wallace's works from the 1970s interrogated the protocols and cultural presence of photography in its relation to text and the cinematic narrative. Such memorable works as La Mélancolie de la Rue, An Attack on Literature, and Image Text were also produced during this decade, where fellow artists and Wallace himself appeared as characters, models, or passers-by. In the first half of the 1980s, Wallace started developing what would become his signature style of juxtaposing photographic prints and monochrome fields on a stretched canvas. Manipulating historicized formats of photography, painting, and text, his works navigate the spaces of the studio and the street as they appear to contain one another. As the critic William Wood put it in 1988, I quote, "Wallace's work inhabits the imaginary as a zone of instability, repetition, and melancholia," end of quote. This imaginary zone will in fact subsequently show an increasing interest for the museum and gallery spaces where it is exhibited, and the institutional environments where it is administrated. And in the past 2 decades, Ian Wallace has recurrently and minutely examined those spaces, including them in many of his compositions. One could argue that the historicization of modern art has become a crucial subject in his, I would venture to say, truncated paintings, where photographs act both as motifs and interruptions. Ian Wallace's work has been shown internationally for more than 4 decades, and it is represented in public collections around the world. It has also been the subject of several retrospectives at the Vancouver Art Gallery in 1988, at Witte de With Center for Contemporary Art in conjunction with Kunsthalle Basel and the Düsseldorf Kunstverein in 2008 and 2009, and again at the Vancouver Art Gallery in 2012. Ever in his long career, Ian Wallace has prolifically taught and written about art history, promoted exhibitions and publications of concrete poetry, and built one of the largest collections of books on conceptual art in Canada that he donated to Vancouver's Emily Carr University, we had been teaching for many years. As a final note, I would like to say that the constant presence of artists and art in his oeuvre makes the phrase artists on artists return to the viewer's mind very often, and especially tonight. So please join me in welcoming Ian Wallace to the end.
Thank you very much, Manuel. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here. I've looked forward to this for a while and spent quite a lot of time researching and really enjoying the research and kind of rethinking what I see. And what's really going to be my main topic for the evening is not necessarily about Blinky Palermo per se, but through Blinky Palermo's work and some of the problems that he approached as a painter, to look at the situation of painting really in the late 60s primarily, during the period of his career, and how he responded to those conditions that many, many painters also experienced at that time. And I'm going to be looking at quite a lot of work, and some of it I'll go through quite quickly. If anybody wants me to slow down on any particular point with questions or comments, please don't hesitate to just interject. And I've written out my text at some point. I suppose it could be published, but I'd rather on this occasion just speak to you directly, basically through the work. Now, some of my arguments, my points I'm going to put forward are kind of subtle, and in some cases I'm still refining them and working them out to convince myself that I'm on the right track. So I'm certainly open to any kind of contributions and criticisms, especially after. Maybe we'll have a question period. You know, so I certainly welcome your participation in that level. The question about painting, of course, contemporary art involves a lot of different practices. Painting isn't the only one, but one point I am going to put forward is one which some of you might be quite critical about, is I'm kind of proposing painting as what I call the horizon of art. In other words, the auratic value, in other words, the commitment that we have to art in general is kind of finds its primary site in the practice of painting through, as I see it, as approximately more than 500 years of pictorial art on canvas, and of course much longer in the development of pictorial art in other forms, has put it in the position of painting a very, very specific relationship to what our culture values as art in general in that particular practice. Now, as we go through my thesis, in effect, that I'm going to put forward to you, is that at a particular, there's very particular periods where we come into what I call a crisis of representation, where the functional value of painting to represent pictorially images of the world to satisfy the meanings that any particular culture wants to put forward, those pictorial relationships are actually carry a certain function, and that function is changed, and that function is shifted from one medium to another. So we'll see as I deliver my proposal, how painters practicing the point of painting, especially in the late 60s, is the critical point that crosses over the career of Blinky Palermo, comes under particular stress and begins to have what I call the anxiety of the wall, as we'll see. That this is one way to look at the work of Blinky Palermo, and it's one expression of my own work as an artist, as Manuel described in the late 60s, when I came in to experience what I call the anxiety of the wall. And we'll see the various changes that I went through in doing that in relationship to how I'm interpreting the trajectory of the work of Blinky Palermo. A think for those of you that are not entirely familiar with Blinky Palermo, for some of you, and I know some of you are very, very informed about his work, I'm going to, if you don't mind, I'm going to just give a very, very brief précis of the trajectory of his work, just as a kind of to get started on having a sense of it. This is an example of Times of the Day #1 from 1974. It's a later work of Blinky Palermo that he did while he was in New York City, when he moved to New York City for a few years in the early 70s. And this is Times of the Day #2. They're acrylic paintings on aluminum panels. They're only 20 by 20 inches each. And they structure this work as you're probably familiar with if you've ever been to Dia Beacon, of course, and I'm sure most of you have. It forms the basis of his great late work, the last work he did before he died in 1977, at the very early age. To the People of New York City is the title of his last major work, which is what I'm going to focus on at the end. Palermo was born in 1943, same year as I was, so we were the same age. In his early years, he entered the Dusseldorf Academy in 1962, so he'd been 19 years old, and amazingly enough, when you look at the body of work he did, some of the most valued work of his work was work that he did as a student. And that is quite a unique and unusual situation. Most artists' work do not, in a sense, enter the pantheon of works appreciated until well after they've left an educational art school situation. And I think that says something for the Dusseldorf Academy and the teaching program that they had there, which was very, very open. His early works were inspired by Bruno Goller, who was his first teacher, and then Joseph Beuys, a very famous and influential teacher at the Dusseldorf Academy from 1964 to 1967. This is a piece that's in the Dia collection called Totem from 1964. One of his earliest ones. It's 64 to 67, actually. It's dated over a few years, so he must have done addenda and changes to it as he went along. His early works are quite, they always puzzled me when I first came across them, and because they were quite eccentric. They didn't fit into what I was looking for in the 60s as kind of more rigorous, what I thought was a kind of a more rigorous approach to form. His works were quite open. Very much, I think, influenced by Fluxus, kind of a loose and Fluxus and very improvisational relationship to painting. I'm going to make a particular point about painting in relationship to his work, and that's the idea of what I call the withering away of the space of painting and the collapse of the space in the field of painting that could hold or represent any kind of image. In other words, it's the end of painting as a form of pictorial art, as we see in this one we're just looking at. There's really almost no room in this painting, and it is a painting because it is technically canvas stretched over a wooden board, and then canvas stretched over, looks like wooden boards, and then painted with the signature blue triangle. Quite awkwardly and quite spontaneously, and in a sense it's kind of a very vulnerable kind of work. One that critics could be forgiven for lambasting. Seeing what we want to do in the work of Palermo, I think, is to see his work as a totality, to see how it fits into the might say the trajectory of the career of an artist that's struggling with holding on to the possibilities for painting at a time when painting was under incredible stress. These are paintings that actually he became really well known for from the 1966 to 72. He did a series of paintings called Stoffbilder in German, or cloth paintings or fabric paintings. And all he did was very much a work using kind of color as a ready-made, or the material as a ready-made. He just bought, yardage from commercial fabric stores and had them sewn into these kind of compositions, banded compositions, and then stretched over conventional stretcher frames. So again, he became quite well known for this work. In some ways, it paralleled some certain aspects of minimal and formalist work that was coming out of New York City at the time that he himself was exposed to. So the work, he got a certain amount of recognition for this particular work. I'm just going through very, very quickly a little kind of a run through of his career before I get into the meat of my thesis here. This is starting in the late 60s, he started doing painting on the wall directly as kind of a just basically wall painting. And this is one he did for the Documenta 5 of 1972. I'm sorry, I don't have a color picture. It's bright, kind of a very strong orange, which is one of his favorite colors, which we saw in the totem painting we just saw earlier. This is an example of just one shot, excuse me, from the to the people of New York City. In a sense, an homage that was finished in, well, it was found in his studio when he died in 1977. Probably begun in 1976, completed in 1977. He died on a holiday in the Maldives Islands at the age of 33. This is the work that I want to have a close look at. It's in the Dia collection. At first sight, one could be, like, what is this all about? What is this piece? It's a very eccentric piece. It doesn't really, one looks for the necessity of it or the sense in it, other than just as a quixotic or eccentric composition at first sight. I'm looking at it quite closely later on after I make a few proposals. So this would be an example, as I see it, of his, his early, it's done in 1965. So he's 22 years old at this time. Title? Oh, sorry. Winkel Rot-Weiß. Angle or red-white angle. That's a very simple title. Now, sorry for the major jump here. A Raft of the Medusa. Sorry, it's not a very good slide. But what I want to talk about is history painting. It's a subject that doesn't come up very much in the discourse of contemporary art. But I think there's something in history painting that has a very, very important relationship to the position that painting, the stresses that painting came under in the late 60s. Can everybody hear me all right? I'm not using the microphone, so I hope that's not a problem, right? Now, again, back to my earlier comments about the history of painting as over approximately, if we, 500 years, 5 centuries of the function of painting, of carrying either, cultural, sociological, and mostly religious kind of meaning. What the picture space of painting carried culturally right up to the early 20th century was, you might say, the impacted subjective desires of any culture that was mostly of Western European culture in its outflow, impacted within that picture frame all of that kind of condensed embodiment of the idea of meaning, of the idea of signification for that particular culture. And I'm referring to that very much in the abstract. In the case of history painting, though, usually the major history painting of, right up to the early 20th century had very specific meanings. Like this was the Raft of Medusa was a very specific, almost journalistic representation of a scandalous major event of the abandonment of a crew from a ship by the shipmasters in very early 19th century, sorry. 1819 is the completed work by Giraud. And it's a huge painting. It's approximately 20 feet by 30 feet. Some of you have probably seen it. It hangs in its own very special space in the Louvre. The point I want to make about this painting here is that up until the early 20th century, painting like this took the place of major public spectacle for subject matter. In other words, when somebody wanted to be a painter and an artist, this is what not all of them, not every painter, but this is what a painter would aspire to, in effect, of creating what in the 19th century would be the equivalent of a major spectacular film, like a modern film. My point that I want to make is that with the invention of film, of early cinema, history painting, and all of the impacted idea of what a painter could be was suddenly, in a sense, stolen from the practice of painting by the spectacle media of modern cinema. And here's The Birth of a Nation by D.W. Griffith from 1915. And if you look at the axis, the cross of the invention of spectacular cinema and modern abstract painting, they exactly cross. Like the beginning, for instance, some of my favorite examples, the collages of Picasso and Braque of 1912 were, in effect, the beginning of the decrepitude or debilitation of the end of painting. But they were also the beginning of modern abstract art, which is the trajectory that's going to take us to Blinky Palermo. For the public spectacle and the idea of painting and the idea of meaning, the specific narratives of meaning were taken over by modern film. Today would be what? Showa, Apocalypse Now, you name it. Any number of kind of major films. Various forms of history painting were continued in the 20th century, even after they became obsolete within the practice of painting. Guernica by Picasso would be a classic example. This would be fall in what I would call as history painting. Now, why am I talking about history painting in relationship to Blinky Palermo? Because I want to get to another group of artists who I think carried on the scale and you might say, the heroic impact of the idea of signification of history painting in a large mural format, but in the practice of pure abstract art. And this, of course, are the great masters of the New York School, particularly Pollock's one that's in the Museum of Modern Art, and the other one that is Barnett Newman's Vir Heroica Sublimis. I mean, even the title gives it away, the sublime and heroic life. The scale of this work, other than, you might say, the beautiful decorative impact of the work, and I don't mind using the word decorative here, because the work is obviously more than decorative, so it can also be decorative, right? Is in the scale. And question?
Isn't that called Vir Heroicus?
Vir Heroic.
Heroica
Sublimis.
Isn't that the title of Rocco's painting?
We can have questions later.
Okay.
Yeah. No. Thank you for your comment. Please. Sorry. Can you say that again?
He said the right Vir Heroica Sublimis.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Did you say the title? Okay.
Vir Heroica Sublimis.
Okay.
Yeah.
But let's not just all the questions later. Thank you.
Beautiful painting. This is at the Museum of Modern Art. It's not the current installation, but this is a few years ago. I came in. They had it hanging next to The Wild. Another work done at exactly the same time by Barnett Newman. But where the grand scale of history painting is totally collapsed into this single whole. And it's, one of the more, like, one can be, totally engaged with it, but, it leaves open absolutely, totally questions like, what happened here? What is this? This is the questions that I ask as an artist. And you can always tell an artist in a museum is because they're always trying to look behind the painting, not at the front. I kind of I wanted to poke at it and find out if he's actually made a real stretcher bar, with quarter rounds and everything on it. I don't know. I've got to continue my research on this. Is this actually a properly constructed stretcher bar, or is it just, as my intuition first told me, is it just an extra bar of which is exactly the same height as the right-hand side of Vir Heroica Sublimis. Now, there's two kind of conclusions that come out of this. One is Barnett Newman is experimenting, in effect, with the complete withering away of the space, of the pictorial space of the painting. Like, what is the minimum conditions that an object can be and still be a painting? And what does this have to do with Blinky Palermo? Is that this is what Blinky Palermo was experimenting with in his own work. Not just Blinky Palermo, but many other artists of this period. Another interesting and curious aspect of this is this line on this side of Barnett Newman's painting was painted a year after. In fact, after he first exhibited it. So I think this painting was done first, this was done, and then the line was done. What I call the wild and the extra line. I don't know. I don't have anything conclusive about it, except that what it's done is it's led me into a way of looking at one of Blinky Palermo's works. But before we do that, here's just another shot of the wild. It's an amazing painting. It is a painting. One was, of course, Barnett Newman's eureka moment of 1948, when he realized that that line was all he needed on this canvas. Here's a close-up of the wild, and you can see that it's quite roughly painted. It's only a little over 2 inches wide, almost not enough space to have a proper, or even need, a proper quarter rounds to hold the canvas away from the wood of the stretcher bar itself. And there's the extra line. And this is red-white angle. Now, in looking at this at Dia Beacon, what was in my mind was still these questions about Barnett Newman's work. So there's a narrative here. I went from questioning and doing research on this question about Barnett Newman's work up to Dia Beacon. And then, of course, in Dia Beacon, many amazing works. I've been up there many times. And it's just always an amazing experience. This time I focused on this. Something that in another instance I might pass by, but this time it got me. And looking at this work, it was like, what is going on? This is like the wild, but it's a bent version of the wild. There's no space for the image, in effect. It's what I call the withering away of the space of painting. It's canvas stretched around a wooden support and painted white and red. Winkel, which means angle, rot-weiß, angle rod, red, white. Let's have a closer look at it. Here's a bit of a, you can see even this, it's kind of, in fact, Palermo, even in these early paintings, he would put kind of like soft material over the wooden support. And so it had a kind of softer, spongy, kind of amorphous kind of quality, not tightly stretched. His stretching and his craftsmanship is not impeccable on these early works. They're quite kind of roughly and loosely done, very influenced by the Fluxus movement at the time. And he was friends with some of the Fluxus artists, including Joseph Beuys, his own teacher, Henning Christensen, the Fluxus musician, etc. This is the back of it. Winkel Red Wise, Palermo, 1965. Here's the bottom end of it. The Dia Conservator kindly had the back of it photographed for me. And yeah, another signature and his address actually there and his phone number. It's a suburb of Dusseldorf, Dorf, Kolkum. See, I'm going to go back one more, two more, sorry. Yep, let's go back to this one here. I don't know, maybe we can get the conservator to unwrap this, really wreck this picture and unwrap it to satisfy my totally superficial question. I think he's got a broken window frame here that he just picked up off the street probably, a garbage can. And you can see where another element must have fitted into here where it's slightly recessed. So I think he just stretched the canvas over a broken window frame, and there you see the beveled inner side of the window frame. I'm not sure what it is. Anyways, this kind of jerry-built, totally kind of wizened kind of form of painting totally kind of fascinates me as, in a sense, signs or examples of a certain condition of painting in the period that Palermo was working. Here's another one of my favorites. It's only about 12 inches like 1 foot in length. It's not very big. It's just canvas stretched over wooden form and painted with gray on it. Totally, on all appearances, kind of a nothing object. But as I say, these works, these little shards of experiment have to be seen as a part of a total project. Now, Palermo was actually, as a young artist, quite lucky. He had very good, he was really in the scene. He didn't miss anything. He went to everything. Met people, the artists that he wanted, was interested in, wanted to know. He was like avid about kind of informing himself about what was going on in the United States. He was totally fascinated with American culture, jazz, contemporary jazz, beat literature, etc. So he very, very early became involved with the Conrad Fischer Gallery in Dusseldorf. Conrad Fischer himself was an artist, also young artist and friends. It was just like a situation where the artists were creating their own situation. Of course, Emil Knobel, Gerhard Richter, other artists who have since become very, very important artists were also his friends and at the time. And Gerhard Richter was 10 years older, so he wasn't exactly a classmate, but they were all hung out in the same situation. Conrad Fischer Gallery was giving exhibitions. It was one of the first galleries in Germany to give exhibitions to people like Karl Andries, Robert Ryman, Richard Tuttle, etc. So the American artists that were starting to take some of the same directions towards what I think superficially got to be called minimal art, etc., were finding their way into the German market and into the becoming familiar with the younger German scene, like an artist like Blinky Palermo. So when he was doing his fabric paintings, of course, he was already familiar with the work of Robert Ryman. Here's a work of Robert Ryman from the Dia collection. Now, Ryman's work is, again, even though it is a rectangular space, the traditional rectangular space of the painting or the space that's meant to hold a picture, but Ryman's work, as you know, you're probably familiar with it, there's no picture represented in it. It's only a process of brushwork, you might say, that's done using different brushes and striations. Ryman, as we see in this detail of the same painting, doesn't paint even right up to the edge. He reveals the ground. Now, what was the outcome of well, I was informed by other things, but what I was focusing on in the work of Barnett Newman, as we saw earlier, was this, and that question about the wild in the Euroocus Sublimis, the full space of the mural painting, was this question of support and ground. Now, I think of the ground as the canvas and the support as the stretcher bars. And what we begin to see here is a kind of a pulling away of the both off the wall. Ryman's work is part of that. Ryman's work on paper, in looking at Ryman's work, it's always the question of how is it attached to the wall? How is it bonded to the wall? And the wall of the gallery is like, in a sense, the other support. And as we'll see in the development of Palermo's work, he uses the wall as the full support. Back to, here's I think it's 66 piece, 1966, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, please, by Robert Barry, which is just the four colored canvases featuring the wall itself. And what I'm looking at now is how the wall starts to come to the foreground in these works. First work I ever saw of Dan Flavin's that totally threw me over was this Out Pink Out of the Corner that I saw in Washington, D.C. in 1967. I think Flavin is one of the first to, in a sense, claim the wall and the light in the space through these kind of the colored accents of the fluorescent tubes as a way to turn the whole space into his palette or into his pictorial space. In other words, the whole wall of the room then becomes his picture space. And we can compare this, it would be interesting to compare this to Barnett Newman in The Wild, where he was working with the material, the concrete, ground of canvas stretched on the support and then hanging on the wall. Flavin's work, in a sense, throws the accent right so that the wall itself becomes the support. Another piece, you're probably familiar with Splash by Richard Serra of 1968. I saw this. This is from the Castelli Warehouse Show, 9 at Castelli in December '68. I saw the show and I took, this is a photograph I took in the exhibition. You know, I was young, you know, in my mid-20s, coming to New York City to see what was going on, you know, to get with the program and get it, you know, there's just so much exciting stuff happening, and still is, of course. But this, you know, works like this was like, whoa, what can you do with this? You know? So I was teaching contemporary art history at the university then, and both Rodney Graham and Jeff Wall were in my classes then. And this is what I was showing them about. Come here and photograph the exhibitions and then go back, and right away they would kind of see what was going on in the Big Apple. Anyways, here's, you know, to move on to this theme, about the anxiety of the wall, I call it. I don't know if that's the right term for it. It sounds good. That artists were having at the time, and the questioning of painting, especially right in the mid-'60s, you had this sudden appearance of what we, you know, called conceptual art, and was started to be called conceptual art then. Joseph Kossuth and Robert Barry himself became one of the most disappeared of conceptual artists. Disappeared in the sense that his work became dematerialized. An example of an artist that is kind of bringing the work off the wall onto the floor, Neil Tironi, at the same time. Another, I'm just going through some of these kind of quickly now. A really iconic photograph of Lawrence Weiner chipping at the way of the wall of the Kunsthalle in Bern for the When Attitudes Become Form show of 1969, his 36 by 36 inch removal piece. I like this piece. It's just, to me, is kind of an allegory in a sense on this problematic of the wall that was starting to appear at the time. Eva Hess's work, where, you know, like in this one and other works, where she kind of crosses that space between the wall and the floor. And of course this was in the Castelli Warehouse Show of 1968, the Eva Hess. Also this one was in the When Attitudes Become Form that followed in those very important exhibitions. Just very briefly, this is an example of one of my early monochromes, almost 8 feet high and about 20 inches wide. It was part of this particular one is part of a whole series of, came out as 30 of them all, just working very much in a silhouette style of kind of permutations of the primary colors plus white, black, and gray. So there were 6 colors, and with the border of another color and the inside of another color. So it came up to 30 paintings in the series. This is just one of them. But that was in 1967. In 1968, I began, here's me in 1968, when I had hair. I was like the token hippie professor at the university. What I started to do was like take my stretcher bars, instead of assembling them to go on the wall as a painting, I just left them on the floor. And I had actually met Carl Andre, and I think Carl Andre's work was kind of an influence on my work at this time. Met Carl Andre in that visit of the fall of 1968. We had a very intense conversation, drinking, as you can imagine. I exhibited quite a few different variations on. Here's an example of it. It's like very, very kind of shabby looking piece, which is partially maybe why I really like the really shabby work of early Palermo too, you know. With the simple planks and 2x4s and what with plastic sheeting over top, which in the plastic sheeting, of course, replaced what the canvas would be. But you can see the structure underneath. I was also, I have to confess, very influenced, and in even my reading of this work, by the writing of Clement Greenberg and Michael Fried and such. You know, people really put them down, and in many cases, very rightly so. But reading those writers, those critics, very carefully, there's some amazing stuff in their writing of real observation of the problematics of art at the time. This is a 2007 exhibition with some reconstructions of these earlier works, including one of my plank pieces in the foreground and a couple of monochromes in the background. In 1969-70, I started returning to the wall again with these pieces I call magazine pieces, in which I just took a regular mass circulation magazine, attached it to the wall with tape, and, you know, in the scale of a history painting. And I thought, at the time, I thought of them as my contemporary version of a history painting, and I think that reading still holds. Here's the schema for the magazine piece in 1970. It just shows the basic layout that anybody can do. It was really tied in with an art top over aesthetic too, as some of Blinky Palermo's work. You know, I had no money. You can't ship big paintings around, but I could easily send instructions for any gallerist to install a magazine piece, and I still do that. It costs almost nothing to put out a piece. Here's a piece that was installed in 2008 at the Wit de Wit in Rotterdam, as a part of a show I did there. Back to the wall again there. Here's a Varese Wall 1975 piece by Robert Ryman in the Dia collection. Again, just to kind of remind us of that. And what I also really like about this piece is he allows the artist to kind of look in behind and see the technical way that it's like fastened and supported, etc. Now we can't really, you know, the whole kind of development of American, what I call high modernism, pardon the term, some people don't like that term, but it works for me. Say the work of, like of Frank Stella were, again, like Barnett Newman's paintings and Pollock's paintings of the period, like, you know, they function like a wall. And I mean, and with incredible spectacle effect as well. So we're like engaged in the incredible, almost shouting colors of Stella's Protractor series here, for instance. And, you know, a little bit of this, I think, is what we're going to find in Palermo's work, you know, his real engagement with color as a kind of a punctuation of the wall. But Palermo's work is not of the single object large size scale, but of punctuation marks through the scale of the wall, as we'll see. Here's Morris Lewis and Kenneth Nolan painting from the Honest collection, which, by the way, is on show right now at House and Worth, just down on 18th Street. Fantastic exhibition, worth to see. Back to the wall and the deconstruction of painting in the wall. Here's an example of a 1968 installation by Mel Bachner at the Conrad Fischer Gallery in Dusseldorf. And it's just to bring us back to Blinky Palermo, it's the same space that Blinky Palermo also did just beforehand, a wall drawing as well, as we'll see. So Blinky Palermo now has started claiming the wall as his kind of grand space to operate as a painter. But some of the pieces of Palermo that I really like, again, are still those, this is called Butterfly 2, are these really quixotic pieces that are made just, I think, just from pieces of wood that he's found, you know, just the thrown away materials, covered in canvas and painted. And then quite poetically, there's a kind of a poetic lyrical edge to Palermo's work of this type. But it just, like, it charges all the space around it. And again, it reminds me of that kind of linearity of the wild by Barnett Newman. Here's a photograph of Palermo. You can see the scale of his work here. It's just a great big plank. I guess he's in the middle of installing it or wants to move it over a little bit, I don't know. He was, in terms of painting on the wall, he did his signature blue triangles that he did installations of exhibitions with the blue triangles. He did a multiple with the blue triangle, and he liked to add a blue triangle above the doors of his favorite friends, the studio doors of his favorite friends. So the blue triangle became, for Palermo, became a kind of a personal signature. And I'll get into this in a little bit here, this question of signature art and how particular kind of mark making, in a sense, in the physical space and the environmental space, becomes identified with a certain idea about authorship, which ties in with my idea about the idea of the heroic in history painting, which I'll come back to again. This is, he also did wall paintings, in effect, that dealt with the whole wall space. This is actually for the Listen Gallery in London, the wall show. I don't think it was actually ever installed, but it was in the catalog. This is Heiner Friedrich in Munich in 1970. Am I correct about the date? Sure, I think it's 1970. Where on one end of the gallery, he's painted an ochre, kind of Munich ochre, on one wall, and the other side, he's just framed the architectural space with the same color. So created a kind of a dynamic ambience with what Christine Mehring in her book on Palermo identifies as kind of a decorative kind of impulse. This wall painting got quite embedded into the architectural structure of the institution. This is the Kunsthalle in Baden-Baden in 1970, and actually I had a digital pointer, but I don't need it. You can see the black line at the top of the wall here underneath the frieze. The line is painted all around the room by Palermo. I believe in a blue, I'm not absolutely certain, but I think it's a dark blue. And that's all that was in the room, just that blue line. And of course, people will go in there and kind of like, either like it or hate it. But be affected by it one way or another. This is an installation he's working on. That's him on top of the ladder up there at the Edinburgh College of Art in 1970 for a large group exhibition. All he did again was paint the interstice between the balustrade and the frieze all around the entrance to this kind of staircase atrium space. Here's an example of the color. We went through the primary colors on it. Here's another picture of him up the... Now, I'm interested in this idea of the heroic here. You won't find me on top of a ladder like that. So there's a, and again, he's painting with a small brush, and like, why didn't he get a professional painter with a kind of a forklift to get him up there or whatever? I think it's a kind of a performance. And this really, it comes out of his relationship to Beuys, because Beuys, as a sculptor, his performances are based upon energizing space through a particular kind of ritualistic movements and timing and of kind of energizing materials in space. And I think that Palermo is doing this as well. Now, this wasn't, Palermo wasn't the only one to do this at this time. Here's Walter de Maria in 1970 with this mile-long drawing in the Nevada desert. But this photograph of him lying, is this 68 or 70?
I think it's late 60s.
Yeah, I'm a, my old art historian sense is, I get a bit kicky about dates, but but I haven't been teaching art history for 15 years now, so I'm getting a bit soft on my dates. In any case, there's a kind of, what I want to identify here is a kind of heroics here that's about space. And this also takes us back to Vir Heroica Sublimis by Barnett Newman again. And of course, Barnett Newman was one of the favorite artists of Blinky Palermo. So this attempt to, and I see it, to bring it back to history painting, and you might say the dynamic spectacle of the space of history painting, I see these artists in their own way, at the same time that there's the withering of the space of painting, they're reconstituting it or reconstructing it on another level, on a very expressive level of a certain kind of performance of authorship. What's that notion of Roland Barthes, the death of the author? I never did buy into that, The authorship is like, and signature is more important now, especially in the art world or in any form of high culture today, than it ever was in the past. Here's, again, Palermo's wall painting for the Documenta 5 in 1972. And at this time, he wasn't the only one doing. I mean, Michael Asher, for instance, right adjacent to Palermo's work in Documenta 5, had also done a painted room. Half of it was painted black and half was white. And Palermo met Michael Asher at that time and then connected with him when he went to California, later when he went to the United States in the early 70s. Well, 2 years later, as a matter of fact, we're already in the early 70s. Here's to the people of New York City. Now, I want to bring us back again to the question about history painting and scale. I'm interested in the title. There's been quite a bit of discussion about the title, To the People of New York City. Palermo left New York City, went back to Dusseldorf. It's thought that he wanted to come back. He applied for a visa. I think he was having some visa problems amongst other things. But he, you know, in this last group of paintings, he was paying a particular kind of homage to the reception that he did get, especially, I believe, amongst the artists in New York City, where he established some very, very strong communications amongst the artists in New York City. Apparently, he didn't make a lot of sales, and he was really living on the edge for the most part, couldn't get his visa renewed, but I believe he probably still wanted to come back. But when he went back to Dusseldorf, he worked on this last series, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, which is the Nadia collection, and it's really one of the great works of the post-war period. Now, the scale of this work, there's 39 different elements in this work, with 15 different groupings, spread in very, very specific spacing around the space of the gallery. It requires a very, very large exhibition space. Again, to bring up this question about the heroic space of painting, the investment of authorship, etc., etc. Also with the title, this kind of idea of addressing a large community, the people of New York City, is moving into the, you might say, the conceptual dimensional space of history painting, but in a very, very modern and contemporary way. I'm going a little over time, but I'm almost finished. Here's the drawings for this particular group. And this is photographs taken by Imi Knoebel in his studio after he died. He was cremated in Sri Lanka. So he never made it back from that holiday, that fateful holiday in February 1977. Another shot, again, of To the People of New York City. And another one. So this is a good one, even though it's not the best color, but it's just this feeling of the light, the intensity of color, the floatingness of the paint on the aluminum, kind of almost moving into our space. It's like a little bit indeterminate how it's fixed to the wall. The kind of this sense of spatiality that exists in it. I think that this is where Palermo, as an artist, went against the withering of painting and decided to reconstitute painting, to move back into, to reposition painting back instead of kind of being shy of it or having the anxiety of the wall, to engage with it 100% and the space within it. I think it signals a new form of maturity in his work. Right after, actually, 78, 79, you have Shadows by Andy Warhol. And, you know, begins in the late 70s now a changeover, I think, from the anxiety that was experienced by artists in the late 60s. Now I'm going to just take one other tack here, and then I'll open up for questions. I just want to kind of go full circle and just turn back a little bit toward the question of history painting again. Really, you know, by the late 70s, suddenly new technologies, the development of photographic technologies allowed for picture making on a grand scale that crossed over to painting, mostly photographic technologies. But in the series of October 18th, 1977 by Gerhard Richter about the Baader-Meinhof funeral, this is just one small portion of this work by Gerhard Richter, which I'm sure you're familiar with, so I won't dwell on it. But it is one of the great history paintings of the post-70s, or of the post-60s, after the demise of history painting as such. Jeff, and just touching on a few examples, Jeff Wall's Dead Troops Talk of 1992, which was done very, very large scale, backlit transparency. You might have seen it at Mary Goodman Gallery and his retrospective that he had at the MoMA. All filmed in a movie set or photographed in a movie set, sutured with the use of a computer. I ventured into, it's my only example of a large-scale history painting on my part, the Clayoquot Protest, which was a series of 9 large canvases about a kind of ecological protest in the forests of British Columbia, in which the police are in the process of arresting about 250 people on this day. Stan Douglas, Vancouver artist, shows also with David Zwerner here. His work from 2007 that was about you might say, a riot in Vancouver in 1971. The work was installed in a kind of a reconstituted, a rebuilt shopping area that was right where the riot took place. It's 30 feet by 50 feet in scale, and it's structured so you can see it from both sides, from the outside and from the inside. This is an inside version, so it's just slightly, it's reversed in scale. By coincidence, I had a studio in that building up in the upper left-hand side. But this work was also made like a modern movie. Stan Douglas, none of this is the actual street. He actually reconstructed a street and a whole set like one would do a movie in a large kind of parking lot, and rebuilt everything and shot the whole thing like one would construct a movie set. So, no, what I'm doing is saying that history painting is not dead, as you might say. It comes back in different forms and in different techniques. However, as an artist, I always gravitate towards the most minor works, like this beautiful little 1964 drawing by Palermo. All it is just 2 little blobs of color, watercolor, on some graph paper. It was so beautiful, to me anyways, like, I wouldn't account for everybody's likes and dislikes in this thing. But, I'm not just mesmerized by scale and the heroics of history painting. I think it's also like the works like this that get me. And of course, the works like Red, White, Angle, or Winkel, Rockface, The White Wing by Blinky Palermo. This is one of his last pieces of this type. And he's just taken a bit of a metal, the white part of it, you see up in the corner, flanging off the black line, is a piece of a road sign that he just kind of appropriated off the street and painted it white and built it into his composition. I think it's an absolutely gorgeous piece. And of course, Dan Flavin's, I thought this would make a nice coda of finishing to my talk, Dan Flavin's monument to Vladimir Tapman in the Dia collection. But do you mind, I just want to show you like a few, very quickly, take 2 minutes of your time, to show a few works that I was working on while I was working on my talk here. This is in the studio with canvas, just an example of some of my more formal abstract works. And I think it's apropos to the talk because it's really dealing with ground and support. What we have in this picture are photographs in my studio of the gessoed canvases that are the same canvases on which the photograph is mounted, together with, it's easier to see maybe in this next one, with a monochrome with a silk screen of a canvas pattern on top of it, so there's a kind of a representation of a canvas pattern. And down here is a scan of raw canvas that's actually been scanned and photographed and then laminated on. But when you laminate the photograph on the canvas, you actually get the canvas texture, so that people looking at it, they think they're looking at real canvas, but they're not. So in these works, I'm really kind of what I call, in a sense, neo-formalist abstract painting, really dealing with kind of doing a kind of a playing with ground and support and surface and representation of it all together at once. This is one of my, like a thematic only about painting in my work. Not all my work is about this kind of thematic, but in these particular works it is. And this is how I want them eventually all to be hung side by side. So there's a kind of a choreography of forms looking at it. And I wouldn't say that my work was directly inspired by Blinky Palermo, but when I'm working on this, which was done quite independently of this talk, I keep thinking about, and so it's directed my thoughts about how to approach Blinky Palermo. And of course, there's many different ways that and the literature on Palermo is incredible. It's just like many, many different, often conflicting interpretations. So I always found it quite amazing, an artist like Palermo with such vulnerable, fragile, fragmentary, and abstract work can bring up so many different impressions and thoughts and questions and engagements with what painting is today and art is today in general. Okay, I'll let it go there, okay?
That was some class. Questions, we have time for a few of them. I think Ian is here to reply to your reactions.
I was wondering, getting back to the Palermo piece dedicated to the people of New York. It's on a large white space, and they're combinations of 3 colors. Do you suppose maybe there was an attempt on his part when he dedicates this to the people of New York to try to make some comment on the racial makeup of New York?
It's possible. He was very interested in First Nations or American Indian art. And he did a major piece called, in the 1976 Venice Biennale that had the 4 colors, white, yellow, black, and red, which was kind of seen as the cardinal points and the cardinal colors so there's that aspect of it. They're the colors of the German flag, the cadmium yellow, red, and black. So I think it's probably more a comment about a German artist speaking to his American friends in terms of the color scheme. Cadmium yellow is one of his favorite colors. In the commentaries on this work, it's always noted that the black is always on the far right in all the arrangements, where in the other colors, the major black square in the center, the other colors kind of move around a bit. So I don't know if that had anything specific to do with the racial makeup or not. I don't know. That's an open question. Any other questions?
Just to pick up on the death of the authorship and that sort of idea, how do you think Palermo's decision to take an adopted name figures into all that?
Oh, yes, very, very Oedipal. He never knew his father. In fact, even when he learned that he was adopted, even the father that he thought he had turned out to be not his real father in further research. It was a part of the confusion and the upsets of everybody's life in the end of the Second World War, in the middle of the Second World War, when he was born. He was given a name, Peter Heisterkamp was kind of his adopted name anyways, the one given to him. And then he was given a name when he was in the Dusseldorf Academy by Anatole, a fellow student, and actually a well-known artist as well, who thought he looked like Blinky Palermo, who was the boxing manager for Sonny Liston. So that was the Blinky Palermo, was kind of a pseudonym taken on by him. That is, now, it could be. Palermo maybe had a slightly self-destructive aspect to his personality too. And he was, I think, troubled in many ways. On a personal level. I don't know him, and I don't know anybody. Well, I do know some people that knew him, but I can't vouch for that one way or another. Theoretically, though, it's a very interesting question. Do you have an impression? Do you have a thought about that?
No, I just think a lot of the mythos surrounding him is not only wrapped up in his early death, but it's also wrapped up in this character,
Yeah.
or this characteristic that he was given, adopted.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, I'm stressing this importance of authorship. In other words, that it's about a person, that there's an individualistic subjectivity aspect here that comes to the foreground that's been really played down in a lot of kind of recent theoretical literature the past 20, 30 years.
The transition to aluminum is interesting. I mean, that he began to work with aluminum. Was that commonly used medium?
Well, metal had been used. I mean, copper was used in the Middle Ages as a painting.
It's rather exceptional that he
Yeah.
began to work with aluminum.
Robert Ryman was working on aluminum beforehand. Palermo actually did some monochromes on steel sheeting just before he moved to the United States. Aluminum was better. It was a lighter medium, easier to handle. I get your point though, because...
Has anyone else done it? I mean, aluminum
Yeah.
is so extraordinary.
Yeah, Robert Ryman had done it,
Oh.
and I wouldn't be surprised if some other artists had done it. Of course, Don Judd was starting to make his aluminum boxes hanging on the wall, not unlike in formation here. So the use of industrial metals rather than traditional canvas was not, it was a part of the vocabulary of materials at that period, and still is, of course.
Any other question?
I'm quite interested in in the history painting kind of narrative that you have, relative to the fact that I've always thought Palermo's work was so involved in the generic that history painting always takes as its premise the most extraordinary moment of any kind of struggle, but homage to the people of New York City is an homage to the most generic modern person. It's so unextraordinary in a way, and I wonder if you have a comment to that kind of attitude of the generic in the work.
It's true, the generic, because history painting is traditionally a form of public spectacle, the generic has a very important part of it. In fact, typically in the history painting, it's the form of address in the title is very important. And usually dating the date, like even Gerhard Richter's title, October 18th, 1977, which is the date, is an important part of the titling of it. Even in my Claquot protest, August 9th, 1993, is a part of the titling. It's part of the conventions of history painting. So there is a generic aspect to that. That is interesting because I was just flipping while I was upstairs in the library at Deal Library. I was flipping through I was thinking, gee, what art magazine would Palermo have been looking at in 1974 when he first came to the United States? And I picked up Arts Magazine, 1974, off the wall, flipped through it, and of course it's Bryce Marden. Bryce Marden, in 1974, there was a review of a show of work almost like this. I'm not saying, and he knew Bryce Marden. I'm not saying that in fact, he met and hung out with Bryce Marden while he was here in the few years he was here in New York City. I'm not saying he copied Bryce Marden, but you're right about the generic aspect in the sense that that was a part of the vocabulary of the time. That's what the abstract painters were dealing with, that particular format at that time, myself included.
The clock pictures I always thought always had some kind of deep chuckle to them, more than
I think so too. Yeah. I first saw them in Crayfield quite a few years ago, and I was just like, "Whoa, this is great!"
I would actually add something to his, I think, very, very relevant remark, which is that when I was hearing you, I was kind of hearing you telling the story of this very old dichotomy of the lyric and the epic genres, and at the same time, as in another axis, there is the other dichotomy of the of poetry and prose, and at the moment when photography takes over, photography and the filmic techniques, photography is including So then the cinematic, when photography takes over, the responsibility of documenting history and representing history and remaking history, then a certain form of prose, which is that of this flat, representation, takes the idea of the epic nature of painting and removes the poetry from it and brings it somewhere else. But the painting that remains attached to the lyric, which is this minor, abstract, insignificant, as you said, fragile and vulnerable painting, as in Blinky Palermo's like scrapbook drawing, remains in a way poetic. The poetry has not been removed from that genre by the technology that is in some way redefining our idea of history and of memory. So I would like you to comment on these genres, the minor, the major genres, the grand, epic, the lyric, and so on and so forth.
That's a whole other lecture.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
You have your own.
Well, in my personal way of looking at things, about those things, whenever I go too far in one direction, I switch and go in the other direction. And I drag some of that back and forth, So this washing back and forth between large scale, small scale, poetry, prose, epic, minor, etc., etc. I think every artist has to have, it works best and works fully when you have a full range of emotions, you might say, like musicians do. Musician with only one range of emotion is not a very interesting musician. You have to have the full range of emotions that comes into it, and techniques and all such. And I think Palermo was doing that. Like from the most fragile little nothing drawings that are like almost like a little detail of a cyclometer or something, to kind of a major output of it's really tragic that he died so young. Would have been just, as an artist, I would have loved to have seen what would he have done in the face of the development of photographic technologies of the late 70s, when there was a whole nother, for myself for instance, there was a whole other range of expression available. What would he as an abstract artist would have done? Would he have turned against this? Would he have turned to photography or back again or whatever? For me, I don't see any reason to be one or another. I want to be everything all at once. But sometimes you aspire to the epic, and other times the truth is found in the smallest thing. That's my opinion.
Also, I'd like to add one last thing. Perhaps prose, I don't know, it's to you, directed to the imagery you get, perhaps prose takes rhyming out of poetry, but it certainly doesn't take poetry out of poetry. Mm-hmm. Perhaps it just takes the rhymes out of poetry, and maybe you can draw a parallel. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was thinking because Ian, where's the microphone? Ian Wallace has used an interesting expression when he referred to the first incorporations of photography in the monochrome. I remember this passage that I think is in one of your texts about the monochrome of photography, and you say that the monochrome as the extremely purified pictorial surface cannot get rid of the aesthetic signification of that surface. So it's immediately considered under the aesthetic possibility, whereas photography, it's not necessarily immediately an aesthetic object. Actually, quite the contrary. Normally, it's just a prose. It's the prose of life represented by a machine, and then superimposing both can create an interesting critique of the relationship, which is, I think, one of the points of your ongoing work. And so, this idea of prose really interested me. The way Ian defined photography as a prosaic, and that's for me the great interest of photography as a naturally intrinsically prosaic medium. And so how it links to how that prose links to history, representations, history painting, and can it reappear in things like the grand format photographs of Jeff Wall or Stan Douglas. Your peers and part of this debate in a very deep sense. So that's why I wanted to bring this conversation there, just because this focus on the minor seemed very thrilling, to me, once this big fact of the photographic prose had been, acknowledged so strongly. So
Photographic images are just by their very nature engaging, you know, especially when they engage with heavy subject matter like Jeff Wall's piece that we just saw, or, you know, major historical events or whatever, even in the imaginary level, compared to, like, what are you looking at here? But there's another kind of poetic energy or prosaic energy, because, like, what is more prosaic than just some paint on some aluminum? But when you actually look closely at these works, like, they're not perfectly painted even, actually. You can actually see different layers and different changes of the color if you look closely on the side. So your eye is tuned to the full space, this kind of beautiful rifts of color, but also down to the finest little detail of application of it in the immediate sense of the trace of the hand, you might say, which I think is pretty important.
But I think it's interesting that the titling, the issue of the title, Man, Heroic and Sublime, the people of New York. In this room, you would be thinking maybe about the people of New York while you're in that environment. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah.
About titling and you're talking prose and poetry.
Yeah.
There you go.
There's, in the title, it's very open. I mean, it makes you think about what is the people of New York. I mean, you are the people of New York. But, you know, it's a big title. I mean, it's a big form of, well, I call it a form of address, because he's actually addressing people through the work.
Maybe one last question before we wrap it up?
Mary just said it makes it a history painting.
Yes, thank you.
All right.
Thank you for your kind attention. Thank you.
Yes,
for the question.